So there I am in the sagebrush grasslands of Montana with a whitetail tag in my pocket, a 270 Winchester in my hands, and this shows up. Well, a big herd of elk isn't what you expect on a whitetail hunt, but when it happens, you would like to be ready to take advantage of it. And we were. I was hunting with Chad Poppleton, a Western and wildlife artist who's really good, by the way. You might want to check him out. He and I had permission on this ranch, and the rancher said, hey, if you're coming for whitetail, you might want to pick up an elk tag because we get a lot of elk on this property. He wasn't kidding. We had our elk tags and we were set when these things showed up. But I had a 270. Is a 270 going to be good enough for elk? This is a perennial question, and a lot of us say absolutely, but plenty of folks say you're crazy to take an elk with a 270, and especially the bullet that I was using. I was shooting Winchester's new, at that time, extreme point bullet, 130 grains. That's considered the light bullet. For elk, you want a 150 grain bullet. That's what they always say. We're going to look at some ballistic numbers and find out what that problem or solution might be. But obviously, I am there doing a job. I am working on a TV show called Winchester World of Whitetail. And they would allow me to take other animals from time to time to spice up the show. So that's why we had our elk tags. Plus, if a rancher lets you hunt and says you can take an elk, you get yourself an elk tag. So we were ready for everything. But while we're out on this open, rolling foothills grassland looking for whitetail, what do you suppose comes over the hill? That big herd of elk. And I mean, this wasn't just a dozen elk or 2 dozen elk or even 100 elk. Hundreds of elk. They were unbelievable. It's like half the mountain range in Montana was on that ranch, and they streamed over that hill, and they milled around on top of it while we are pinned down about 600 yards away on an open grassy hillside. So we just sat down and let them settle. And by golly, they settled to sleeping. That's how much they settled. They felt safe up on that. It was like a moat of grasslands around them. So rather than running into the trees like you think an elk would do, they bedded right in the open. So here's our challenge. Are we going to shoot an elk with a 270, 600 yards away? This is where you need to know what your cartridge does. I have been hunting with a 270 since 1975 or 6, I think. It's a long time, but I'd never shot an elk with one. But I knew what they could do because the 270 has been around for ages, 1925, and it has lots of adherents, especially Jack O'Connor back in the turn of right in the middle of the 20th century. He's the hunting and rifles editor for Outdoor Life magazine, and he was championing the 270. He got it the year after it came out, and just loved it. He took everything with it, even brown bears, moose, elk, caribou, brown bears, a lot of sheep. But at the same time, there was another writer, kind of his competition, Elmer Keith. And Elmer was a crusty old guy who went old school. He wanted big, heavy bullets. The 270, adequate coyote cartridge in his estimation. So this debate was raging back in the middle of the 20th century and through the time that I was growing up and learning to hunt. And even today, it's not nearly as popular as it was back then, but the 270 has cemented itself as a great Western deer hunting cartridge. And a lot of folks use it for elk, but probably not with 130 grain cup and core bullets. And that's what this thing is. Winchester that year had just come out with this new deer season ammunition with the extreme point bullet. And if you look closely, you will see that the tip of that bullet has a larger polycarbonate tip than most of the tipped bullets do. This one beside it is another Winchester bullet. It's the XP3, and it has a tiny tip on it. And we'll discuss what those two tips do differently. But the idea was, since I'm doing a show for Winchester called Winchester World of Whitetail, I was going to be using their new rifle, an XPR, and the new cartridge with the new bullet. So the 270 with 130 grain extreme point bullet is my baby. Am I going to take an elk with it? Darn tootin', I'm going to take an elk with it. Why? Because I can. Now let's look at some numbers, and that'll probably reinforce why I think I can do this, all right? And then we'll talk about bullet performance. So this little bullet is leaving that rifle at 3,050 feet per second. Great, everybody knows the 270 is fast. That produces 2,086 foot-pounds of energy. Just look under the energy column. Now, I zeroed that thing so it would go no higher than 3 inches from my point of aim at any distance. That was around 150 yards. That enabled me to then hold dead on all the way up to 300 yards. You look down your chart under the elevation column to 300 yards and you see minus 2.74. That means that bullet is going to be dropping 2 3/4 of an inch at 300 yards. Not all that much drop. You aim center on a deer's chest, you're going to hit him in the heart or the lungs. Perfect, just aim dead on. So I knew I could make my shot, but what if I have to take the shot at 600 yards? Because that's where those elk were when they bedded down. Look at it, 600, I'm dropping almost 58 inches. That is a lot more drop than I want to try to compensate for with my technique, which is just holding high. When you go to 400 yards with 14 inches of drop, I can compensate and hold just over the back line and drop it into the vitals. That's the technique I've been using since I was a kid. And it works out to 400, sometimes 500 yards, but 600, I don't think so. Plus the wind was blowing about 10 to 15 miles an hour. What do you get for wind drift? Well, a 10-mile-an-hour wind, 10 miles an hour at a right angle. You look at that chart under windage column. At 600 yards, you're blowing that bullet almost 28 inches. I'm not going to effectively compensate for that. You mean it might make sense on a steel target, but not on a game animal. Because if the wind suddenly gusts 5 miles an hour more or drops 5 miles an hour less, I'm probably going to screw up that shot. So I do not want to take a 600-yard shot. Plus, what's that bullet got for energy left at 600 yards? 1,050 foot-pounds. They say 1,500 is a good benchmark for elk. I don't believe that you can't kill an elk with 1,000 foot-pounds of energy in a bullet, because all that bullet has to do is get through the hide and the muscle to reach the vitals. If you can hit the heart and the lungs and tear them up, hemorrhaging, that's what takes your animal. Obviously, if you hit him in the spine, the central nervous system, he's pretty much lights out right there. So I wasn't too concerned about that, other than, is that bullet gonna stand up to it and make it in? If I take this shot, I wanna slide it behind the shoulder. I don't wanna hit the shoulder, because that's where you've got some big bones and some big muscle mass. I wanna get it behind the shoulder. I think it'll do the job. That was my mission. And my brain is thinking, if Winchester wants me to advertise their bullet on a whitetail, if I take an elk with it, 3 times bigger than a whitetail, that pretty much says it's going to be able to take a whitetail, right? So I ought to come out of this a hero. But I said to Chad, we've got to get a lot closer. How are we going to do this? We're going to sneak. I mean, that's why I hunt, to sneak. The excitement and challenge of getting close to the game, man, that's why I'm out there. So even though we could have taken a long, crazy shot at 600 yards, I'm going to get closer. So we start sneaking. Now how? In heaven's name? On a grassy open hillside with the elk on the other hillside 600 yards away, can you sneak? There's nothing to hide behind. But all these elk are sleepy. Now there's a lot of eyes watching, but they're sleepy. And what an elk does is he pays attention to his immediate surroundings, because that's where the cougars and the wolves come from. They're not too worried about something 600 yards away. So unless you're standing erect and really moving a lot, so that they see that action and it catches their attention, and then they look, then you're in trouble. But if you move very slowly and you don't stand up, they don't even notice you. And if they do, you might be a sheep, you might be a coyote. You're so far away, there's really nothing to worry about. So Chad and I both played coyote and started crawling down that hillside until we got down into the ravine where they couldn't see us. And then we ran across, started up, and very carefully peeked up until we started noticing elk antlers and ears. Then we get down and crawled, and then we were about 200 yards away, took a reading with the rangefinder. 200 yards, what's that 270 going to be doing? It's only dropping 2.5 inches. It's only drifting in the wind about 2.5 inches. I can make this shot. And look at my energy. I'm still over 2,000 foot-pounds. But I'd have to stand up to take the shot because of the slope. So we just kept crawling. Now we're down on our hands and knees, Now we're down on our bellies, slithering through the grass, and we're using clumps of sage to line ourselves up with that herd. But the herd spread out so far, we've still got to go agonizingly slowly. And there are two of us, and Chad's bigger than I am. But we just kept easing our way in there, and you can read those animals. They were sleepy. They didn't want to get up. We got within 115 yards of the closest elk. Now, the bull is lying kind of in the middle of a piece of that herd with a cow behind him, and I don't want to shoot through and risk hitting that cow. So we've got to get things to move positions. So I said to Chad, I'm going to get set up in my sticks and behind this sagebrush, and then we're going to mew like a cow and see if we can't get them to stand up. So we started doing all those elk sounds. It didn't bother them a bit. There were so many cows lying around there, they were just used to it. We better try a bugle. Want to try a bugle? And we're going to have to. So we start bugling at these things. We had to do it several times and get pretty darn loud before they finally looked over there and started to stand. I got ready on that bull, and when he stood up, I had to wait for the cows to clear. And when that cow cleared from behind him, I had my shot. 130 grain deer bullet. This is a cup and core bullet. That means it has a gilding metal jacket, fairly thin, and inside of it is a piece of lead, a cable of lead that they cut off, and then they squeeze it into shape. And then they put that polycarbonate tip on there. That prevents the tip from deforming the way a lead tip would. It also increases the ballistics coefficient because it's so sleek and smooth and all that. And then that tip on impact drives back into the lead core to expand it. And that's where you get your expansion, and that increases your wound channel. That kills the animal faster. But on a fairly frangible bullet like that, without a lot of weight, I don't want to hit that major bone. So that's why I very carefully aimed behind the shoulder. And from 120 or so yards away, pretty easy shot. I hit the elk. It went forward kind of tippy-toeing. It didn't take off lunging. It just sort of sickly walked forward about 20 yards, stood there, started to wobble. Now, here's my backup plan. Before I launched all of this, I thought, I had better be ready to hit him with something harder. And knowing that we were going to probably get into elk, and we had the licenses, I sneaked along in my pocket some 150 grain bullets in that 270. And those were the old Winchester XP3 bullet. They didn't even make it anymore in 2014 when we did this hunt. But that is a superior bullet. It's all copper with a hollow nose and a hollow shank in which they put lead and then molecularly bonded it. It is not coming apart. And that's the mass that's going to continue driving that bullet deep. That one risked shooting through the elk. So I had it as my backup. In the chamber, first round was 130 grain. And I thought, if that doesn't work and I need to shoot again, next one up is going to be the 150 XP3, and the two more behind that are going to be as well. And I had loaded the magazine that way. So I was ready, and that's why I took that second shot with this after the cows had cleared behind him, because with that kind of penetration, you risk shooting through. So after he stopped and it looked like he was about to tip over and the cows had cleared, I had thought, elk, they might just decide they're going to stick around for another week with a bullet in them or not, so you just shoot until they're down. So it was safe to shoot again. I put this one high on the shoulder, trying for that high shoulder shot that hits the spine. Down he went. We had him. But when we butchered that and cut up the meat and all, we had gotten incredible performance out of that 130 because I slipped it behind the shoulders, punched through a rib, and blew into the lungs and heart and just tore it up. And that's what does the job. It's the hemorrhaging. It's a lot like a broadhead. Now, those slice neatly, but they're so big and wide that they cut things up, so the 130 worked just fine. But if you're coming out west to hunt and you might tackle an elk in addition to your mule deer or your whitetail, do you want a 270 with a 130 grain bullet, or should you go to 150? Let's look at some numbers on that 150. That one starts off a little slower because it's heavier, 2,900 feet per second, puts out a little bit more energy though, 2,802. That's why folks say if you're shooting a 270 for elk, go with a 150 grain bullet. There's more energy in it. It's likely to penetrate better. But you still have to choose the right bullet. You don't necessarily want that frangible bullet. So keep both those things in mind. And then as you go down the chart, you see that it retains 1,500 foot-pounds of energy clear out to 425 yards. And that's why folks like it in a 270. But still, there are plenty of folks who say, if I'm going all the way out west to hunt, spending all that time and money, do I really want to risk it to a 270? Well, I would, but then I've been at this game for a long time. If I were younger or even an old guy on my first elk hunt and really wanted to make sure, I might want to consider 7 Rem mag or a 300 Win mag. Those are really popular for elk and for a darn good reason. They're obviously much bigger cartridges, they've got more powder in them, and they throw bullets faster, so there's more energy. They shoot a little bit flatter, don't drift as much in the wind. I'm going to go into details on these and compare them to the 270 on Ron Spomer Outdoors TV. If you want to see that and all the ballistics, really detailing the performance of these, rsotv.com. We will cover that in depth. And we'll have all the ballistic charts with all the numbers on it so you can make an informed decision about which one of these you think might work. I've got some video of shooting an elk with that 7mm, and I'll tell you all about the big bull I took with the 300 the next year. And I'll talk about the differences in bullet performance and how the elk reacted on rsotv.com. Don't have time for it right now on this one, guys, but I want to thank you for watching. I want to thank our Patreons for supporting us. It really helps, guys. We really appreciate the support. If you'd like to join the Patreon community, go to patreon.com, Ron Spomer Outdoors. And subscribe to our channel. That always helps keep us on the air, too. Until next time, hunt honest and shoot straight.